Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dark, dangerous, and absolutely soul-crushing life of a medieval witch hunter. The man who stalked through villages with a Bible in one hand and a torture device in the other, hunting for women who might have looked sideways at a cow or brewed tea a little too well. While Hollywood makes them look like righteous crusaders, the truth is, being a medieval witch hunter seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear. No one in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what? I'd like to spend my life terrorizing old women and burning people alive for talking to cats." Becoming a witch hunter wasn't a career fair booth. It was more like getting lost in a very dark forest and deciding to make it your home. Most witch hunters didn't start as professional paranormal investigators. They were failed priests desperate for work, former soldiers with a taste for violence, unemployed lawyers with questionable ethics, or just men who'd read the Malleus Maleficarum once and thought, "Finally, a job where I can combine my religious fanaticism with my deep-seated hatred of women." If you were well-educated, you became a theologian or a proper inquisitor. If you had military training, you joined a mercenary company. But if you just had a suspicious mind, a basic understanding of Latin, and the emotional intelligence of a rabid badger, congratulations, someone somewhere was about to hand you a commission to hunt witches. And those commissions? They weren't for pleasant work. You weren't tracking down cartoon witches with pointy hats brewing love potions in cauldrons. You were hunting real women. Real mothers, daughters, grandmothers, whose only crime was usually being too poor, too old, too smart, or too ugly for the local community's taste. The pay was tempting, assuming you got paid at all. But the work was horrifying, and by the time someone became a witch hunter, they usually had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no soul. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job security. No pension, no glory, no time off. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said, "Professional witch hunter, heretics eliminated, reasonable rates." You just had to stay quiet, move fast, and never, ever let anyone know you sometimes doubted whether that old woman really was making a pact with Satan, especially not loudly over ale at the inn. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a medieval witch hunter. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spat them out wearing a black robe and carrying a manual on identifying devil's marks. And you weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live to collect your final payment. Let's start with how you even got this cursed job in the first place. Medieval witch hunters didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspirational Gregorian chanting in the background. There was no training program, no teacher, no orientation packet. Just a copy of Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum and a pat on the back from whatever local authority was tired of dealing with the witch problem themselves. If you learned anything, it was by not getting killed the first few times you tried. Most witch hunters weren't trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of paranoia and the ability to read Latin without vomiting. If you had legal experience, great. That meant you knew how to make torture sound legitimate. If not, well, accusing someone of witchcraft is fairly intuitive, but surviving the backlash when you're wrong, that takes skill or luck. Usually just luck. There were no manuals beyond the Malleus, no guild meetings, no safety briefings. You didn't get taught how to spot actual devil worshippers or where witches keep their spell books. You figured it out while standing in a courtroom wondering if you just condemned an innocent baker to death for having a birthmark. Identifying witches? That was trial and error with heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes your accusation stuck and someone burned. Sometimes the accused had powerful friends and you found yourself on the wrong end of a defamation lawsuit. Sometimes you accused the wrong noble's daughter and disappeared into a dungeon. Sure, if you were lucky, and I mean struck by lightning while holding a four-leaf clover lucky, you might have picked up some theological training from priests or legal knowledge from actual inquisitors. Maybe an older witch hunter showed you how to examine suspects for devil's marks without them dying of infection first. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived because witch hunters don't retire. They either burn out, get murdered by angry villagers, or end up accused of witchcraft themselves. Weapons training? Forget it. You weren't carrying a sword or fighting demons with holy water. You had a magnifying glass, some rusty torture implements, and whatever passed for legal documents in whatever backwater jurisdiction hired you. Success didn't come from combat training. It came from being paranoid enough to see Satan everywhere and charismatic enough to convince others you were right. Your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Just sleepless nights, angry mobs, and the creeping realization that you were very much on your own in a job that made everyone hate you, including yourself. You might picture yourself striding into villages like some righteous agent of God, cape billowing in the wind, townspeople cheering your arrival. Think again. When a witch hunter rolled into town, people didn't celebrate, they hid. You weren't a hero arriving to save the day, you were a plague, a walking disaster that turned neighbor against neighbor, family against family. Your presence meant someone was going to die, and nobody knew who. Villages would go quiet when you appeared, shutters would close, conversations would stop, children would be hustled indoors, because everyone knew that witch hunters didn't just hunt witches. They manufactured them. They turned suspicion into accusation, rumor into evidence, and fear into profit. Your arrival was announced not by trumpets, but by whispers. The witch hunter is here. Hide the women. Burn anything that looks suspicious. Pray you haven't done anything to attract attention. You'd set up in the local inn or, if you were lucky, the manor house. But even then, you were never truly welcome. You were tolerated, feared, and watched. Every conversation stopped when you entered a room. Every smile was forced. Every greeting was careful. The local authorities might have summoned you, but that didn't mean they liked you. They needed someone to blame for crop failures, livestock deaths, or just general bad luck. You were their scapegoat manufacturer. You'd point fingers, make arrests, and take responsibility for all the horrible things that would follow. Even the clergy kept their distance. Sure, they preached about the devil and the dangers of witchcraft, but they didn't want to get their hands dirty with the actual hunting. That was your job. You were the one who had to look into the eyes of accused women and decide if they lived or died. And the smell. Oh, the smell. You carried the stench of fear, torture chambers, and burning flesh wherever you went. It clung to your clothes, your hair, your soul. People could smell you coming from 3 streets away. Not literally, but the psychological stench was worse than any physical odor. You were never invited to stay long. Do your job and leave, fast, before people started asking too many questions about your methods or your motives. Before they started wondering if maybe you were the real problem. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth. Witch hunters didn't find witches, they created them. Now let's talk about your tools of the trade. Forget the fantasy novels and gothic horror movies. There were no silver crosses, holy water dispensers, or mystical amulets blessed by the Pope. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could beg, borrow, or steal to make your accusations stick and your torture sessions productive. Your most important tool? The Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of Witches. This delightful little tome, written by Heinrich Kramer in 1487, was essentially a how-to guide for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. It was your Bible, your manual, and your legal justification all rolled into one misogynistic masterpiece. The Malleus taught you that women were naturally more susceptible to demonic influence because they were more credulous, had slippery tongues, and possessed weak memories. It helpfully explained that all witchcraft came from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. Charming, right? But the book wasn't just theological rambling, it was a practical guide. It told you how to conduct interrogations, what questions to ask, and how to interpret the answers. Every stuttered response was evidence of guilt. Every confident denial was proof of demonic protection. You literally couldn't lose, except for your humanity. Your physical tools were equally pleasant. The bodkin, a long, thin needle used to search for devil's marks on the accused's body. You'd strip the suspect naked and poke every mole, scar, or blemish looking for spots that didn't bleed or feel pain. Of course, with enough jabbing, you could make any spot seem insensitive. Scales for weighing suspects, because everyone knew witches weighed less than regular people due to their ability to fly. The fact that malnutrition and fear might make someone underweight was irrelevant. Light meant guilty. Ropes for binding, because confession under torture was considered more reliable than voluntary confession. The logic was flawless. If someone confessed while being tortured, they must be telling the truth, because why would they lie while experiencing unimaginable pain? And then there were the specialized torture devices. The strappado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were lifted by a rope, dislocating their shoulders. The thumb screws, which did exactly what they sound like. The rack, for stretching confessions out of reluctant suspects. You didn't need to be an expert torturer, just creative and persistent. The goal wasn't information, it was confirmation. You already knew they were guilty. The torture was just to make them admit it. But here's the dark irony. These tools weren't just for the accused, they were psychological torture devices for you too. Every time you used them, you died a little inside. Every scream, every broken bone, every false confession extracted through agony, it all stayed with you. You might have been the hunter, but you were also being hunted by your own conscience, assuming you still had one. Your equipment was basic, brutal, and designed for one purpose: manufacturing guilt, and the manufacturer was you. Being a witch hunter meant living in a world where everyone was potentially evil, including yourself. Paranoia wasn't just an occupational hazard, it was a survival skill. You had to be suspicious of everyone and everything, because in your line of work, trust could get you killed, excommunicated, or worse, accused of witchcraft yourself. Every interaction was loaded with danger: the baker who gave you a strange look, possibly cursing your bread; the innkeeper's wife who served you with trembling hands, clearly plotting to poison you; the priest who asked too many questions about your methods, obviously corrupted by demonic influence. You lived in constant fear of retaliation, not just from the families of your victims, but from the supposed witches themselves. You were taught that witches could curse from a distance, send demons to torment you in your sleep, or transform into animals to stalk you through the night. Sleep became a nightmare. Every shadow was a shape-shifting witch. Every strange noise was a demon. Every dream was a potential psychic attack. You'd wake up exhausted, more paranoid than when you went to bed. And the isolation. Oh, the isolation. You couldn't trust anyone, and no one trusted you. Other witch hunters were competition and potential threats. Local authorities kept you at arm's length. Common people avoided you like the plague. Even your own family, if you still had one, would eventually distance themselves from your work. You developed rituals to protect yourself: obsessive prayer, constant examination of your own body for devil's marks, wearing protective amulets, carrying holy water. But none of it really helped, because the real enemy wasn't external demons. It was the growing certainty that you were becoming the very evil you claimed to fight. The worst part? You started seeing witchcraft everywhere. The old woman who looked at you funny, obviously practicing maleficium. The young woman who was too beautiful, clearly using supernatural means to enhance her appearance. The married woman who argued with her husband, definitely under demonic influence. Your world became smaller and darker with each case. You stopped seeing people and started seeing potential accusations. Every conversation became an interrogation. Every friendship became suspect. Every moment of peace was just the calm before the next supernatural storm. Paranoia became your constant companion, your closest friend, and your most reliable enemy. Because in a world where you made your living destroying lives based on suspicion and fear became the only things you could rely on. And deep down, you knew the terrible truth. If anyone deserved to be accused of serving the devil, it was probably you. Let's talk about your day job, literally ruining people's lives based on the flimsiest of evidence. As a medieval witch hunter, you weren't looking for actual supernatural phenomena. You were looking for excuses to arrest, torture, and execute people who couldn't defend themselves. Your evidence standards were, to put it mildly, flexible. A woman arguing with a neighbor before that neighbor's cow died. Witchcraft. Someone being seen near a crossroads at night. Obviously meeting with demons. A widow living alone with too many cats. Practically a signed confession. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist in your world. Everyone was guilty. They just hadn't been caught yet. Your job was to find the proof. And if the proof didn't exist, well, torture had a way of creating it. You'd start by gathering testimony from neighbors, family members, and anyone with a grudge. This wasn't detective work, it was gossip collection. He said, she said, they said. Every rumor became evidence, every suspicion became fact. The accusations were always the same. The suspect had the evil eye and could curse people with a glance. They could turn milk sour, make crops fail, cause impotence, or kill livestock. They flew to Sabbaths where they danced with the devil and plotted against good Christians. Physical evidence was even more ridiculous. Birthmarks, moles, scars, or any unusual skin condition became devil's marks. If you couldn't find any obvious marks, you'd search more thoroughly. Strip the suspect naked, shave off all their hair, and examine every inch of their body with a magnifying glass and a sharp needle. Found a spot that didn't bleed when pricked, devil's mark. Found a spot that did bleed, but the suspect didn't react with sufficient pain, devil's mark. Couldn't find any suspicious spots. Obviously, the devil was protecting them, which was also evidence of guilt. The water test was a particular favorite. Tie up the accused and throw them in a river or pond. If they floated, they were guilty because water rejected evil. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. Either way, problem solved. Confessions were the gold standard, and you knew exactly how to get them. Start with isolation and sleep deprivation. Keep the suspect awake for days until they were hallucinating and would say anything to make it stop. Then move on to physical torture, increasing the intensity until they confessed to whatever you wanted to hear. But here's the thing about torture. People will confess to anything if you hurt them enough. They'll implicate their neighbors, their family members, their friends. They'll admit to flying to witch Sabbaths, having sex with demons, and eating babies. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. Confession was confession. The really sick part, you probably knew most of it was nonsense. Deep down, you knew that old woman wasn't really flying around on a broomstick or turning into a cat. But admitting that would mean admitting your entire profession was built on lies, torture, and murder. So you kept going, kept finding guilt where none existed, kept destroying lives to justify your own existence. because stopping meant facing the truth. You weren't fighting evil, you were creating it. Let's dive into the delightful world of medieval torture chambers, where you spent most of your working hours trying to extract confessions from people whose only crime was usually being female and unfortunate. Your torture sessions weren't random acts of violence, they were carefully orchestrated theatrical performances designed to break both body and spirit. The interrogation always started the same way: isolation. You'd have your suspect thrown into a dungeon cell, preferably underground, damp and rat-infested. No windows, no light, no human contact, except for the occasional guard bringing moldy bread and stagnant water. You'd leave them there for days, sometimes weeks, letting fear and uncertainty do the preliminary work. Sleep deprivation came next. Guards would poke the suspect with sticks every time they tried to rest, or you'd have them walked around the cell continuously for days. The human mind breaks surprisingly quickly without sleep. People start hallucinating, confusing reality with dreams, and become desperately willing to say anything to make the torment stop. Then came the real fun. You'd have the suspect brought to the torture chamber, usually in the basement of whatever building you were using as headquarters. The sight alone was designed to terrify. Stone walls blackened with soot, tables covered with instruments of pain, the lingering smell of fear and burnt flesh from previous sessions. The strappato was your bread-and-butter torture device. Tie the victim's hands behind their back, attach a rope, and hoist them into the air by their arms. The shoulders would dislocate almost immediately, accompanied by a distinctive popping sound and screams that could be heard through stone walls. You could add weights to their feet for extra efficiency. The rack was for when you needed more dramatic results. Strap the victim down and slowly stretch their body until joints separated and bones cracked. The beautiful thing about the rack was its precision. You could control exactly how much damage you inflicted, stretching out the confession process for hours or days. Thumbscrews were perfect for delicate work. Crush the thumbs slowly while asking questions. The pain was excruciating but not immediately life-threatening, so you could keep going as long as necessary. Plus, the victim could still speak clearly, which was important for getting those detailed confessions. Water torture was particularly effective on women. Strap them to an inclined board, cover their face with cloth, and pour water continuously. The sensation of drowning, combined with the inability to breathe, would break most people within minutes. But the real art was in the psychological torture. You describe in vivid detail what you were going to do before you did it. You'd heat up the branding irons in front of them, let them smell the metal getting hot, see the red glow. The anticipation was often worse than the actual pain. You'd also use their loved ones as leverage. Threaten to torture their children, their spouses, their parents. Or better yet, bring family members into the chamber and torture them in front of the accused. Amazing how quickly people confess when they're watching their daughter's fingernails being pulled out one by one. The confession itself was always the same. They admitted to being witches, having sex with the devil, flying to Sabbaths, and plotting against good Christians. They'd name accomplices, usually other women in the community who had made enemies or attracted suspicion. Each name meant another arrest, another torture session, another execution. And here's the truly sick part. You probably convinced yourself you were doing God's work. Each scream was a demon being driven out. Each confession was a soul being saved. Each execution was a victory for good over evil. But deep down, in the quiet moments between sessions, you had to know the truth. You weren't fighting the devil, you were serving him. Now, let's discuss the theater of the witch trial, where you got to play prosecutor, judge, and executioner all rolled into one black-robed package of righteous fury. These weren't fair trials in any sense we'd recognize today. They were elaborate performances designed to give a veneer of legality to what was essentially premeditated murder. The trial would begin with great fanfare. The accused, usually already broken by weeks or months of torture, would be dragged into whatever passed for a courtroom. This might be the local church, the town hall, or just a large room in the manor house. The important thing was that it be public, with as many townspeople crammed in as possible. You'd sit at an elevated table, surrounded by legal documents, religious texts, and the tools of your trade. Your appearance was carefully calculated. Black robes to represent the gravity of the proceedings, a large cross to show your religious authority, and a stern expression that suggested you'd already decided the outcome. The charges would be read aloud in Latin, which none of the accused could understand. This wasn't about communication, it was about intimidation. The flowing syllables and official tone made everything sound more serious and supernatural. Then came the evidence presentation. You'd call witnesses, usually neighbors with grudges or people you'd already tortured into making accusations. They'd testify about strange occurrences, mysterious illnesses, and suspicious behavior. The fact that most of these witnesses were either coerced or motivated by personal vendettas was irrelevant. Physical evidence would be presented with great ceremony. The devil's marks found on the accused's body displayed on charts and diagrams. Supposed witches' tools, herbs, bottles, unusual stones, or anything else found in their possession that could be interpreted as magical implements. A kitchen knife became an anthem. Medicinal herbs became poison ingredients. A pet cat became a demonic familiar. The confession was the centerpiece of the trial. You'd have the accused repeat everything they'd admitted under torture, usually while they were still too broken to recant. They'd describe their pact with the devil, their attendance at witch sabbaths, and their crimes against the community. The fact that these confessions were extracted through unimaginable pain was never mentioned. Defense? What defense? The accused might be allowed to speak in their own defense, but anything they said was used against them. Maintain their innocence? Obviously lying, which proved their guilt. Break down and confess again? Clearly guilty. Show no emotion. Unnaturally cold, probably protected by demonic power. Show too much emotion, hysterical, definitely a witch. The verdict was always the same. Guilty. You'd spend several minutes explaining the legal and theological justification for the decision, citing various authorities and precedents. This wasn't because there was any doubt about the outcome. It was to demonstrate your learning and make the whole proceeding seem more legitimate. Sentencing was where you really got to shine. Death by burning was the standard punishment, but you could get creative with the details. Sometimes you'd order the victim to be strangled before burning, which was considered merciful. Sometimes you'd have them burned alive, especially if they recanted their confession or showed insufficient repentance. For repeat offenders or particularly heinous cases, you might order additional tortures before execution. Mutilation, being dragged through the streets, or having body parts cut off and displayed as warnings to others. The trial usually ended with a sermon about the dangers of witchcraft and the importance of remaining vigilant against the devil's influence. You'd encourage the townspeople to report any suspicious behavior and praise them for their role in protecting the community from evil. And then, with great ceremony and fanfare, you'd order the execution to proceed. Justice had been served, the community was safe, and you'd earned your fee for another successful witch hunt. But as you watched the flames consume another innocent victim, did you ever wonder if maybe, just maybe, you were the real monster in this story? The burning itself was the grand finale of your witch hunting career, the moment when all your investigative work, torture sessions, and legal proceedings culminated in a spectacular public execution that served as both entertainment and warning to the community. Executions weren't quiet affairs held in private courtyards. They were major public events, like medieval Super Bowls crossed with religious revivals. The entire town would turn out, from the youngest children to the oldest grandparents. Vendors would set up stalls, selling food and drink. People would bring blankets and make a day of it. The condemned witch would be brought out in chains, usually after spending their last night in prayer with a priest who tried one final time to save their soul. They'd be paraded through the streets to give everyone a good look at what happened to those who consorted with the devil. The pyre was built with careful attention to both efficiency and symbolism. Green wood that would burn slowly and produce maximum smoke and suffering for the unrepentant. Dry kindling for those who'd confessed and shown proper remorse. Sometimes the executioner would tie small bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck to ensure a quicker death, but only if you'd specifically ordered this mercy. As the witch hunter, you got to play master of ceremonies. You'd read the charges one final time, offer the condemned a last chance to confess any remaining sins, and then signal for the execution to begin. This was your moment of triumph, proof of your success in ridding the community of evil. But here's what no one told you about being the guy who orders people burned alive. The smell stays with you forever. Burning human flesh has a distinctive odor, sweet and sickening, that clings to your clothes and hair for weeks. You'd smell it in your food, in your sleep, in quiet moments when you thought you'd forgotten. The sounds were worse than the smell. The screaming usually stopped after the first few minutes, either from death or from smoke inhalation rendering the victim unconscious. But those first few minutes felt like hours. The high-pitched shrieks of agony would echo off the surrounding buildings, and you'd see children in the crowd covering their ears and crying. Sometimes things went wrong. The wood wouldn't catch properly, and you'd have to wait while the executioner threw on more kindling. Sometimes the victim would break free from their bonds and try to escape the flames, requiring the guards to push them back into the fire with long poles. Sometimes they'd recant their confession at the last moment, throwing the entire proceedings into theological chaos. And then there were the eyes, the way people looked at you after the execution. The children who'd never see you the same way again. The adults who'd realized they just watched their neighbor burned alive based on the testimony of a woman who'd been tortured into saying whatever you wanted to hear. Some in the crowd would cheer and shout about justice being served. Others would stand in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. A few would quietly slip away, clearly disturbed by the spectacle. But the worst part? The nagging doubt that would creep in during the quiet moments afterward. When the crowd had dispersed and the ashes had cooled, you'd be left alone with the knowledge of what you'd done. You'd burned a human being alive based on evidence that wouldn't hold up in a modern parking ticket dispute. Sure, you'd tell yourself they were guilty, that you were protecting the community from supernatural evil. But deep down, in the part of your soul you tried not to examine too closely, you knew the truth. You weren't a hunter of witches, you were a creator of victims, and every pyre you lit burned away a little more of your own humanity. Let's talk about the money side of the witch hunting business, because, yes, it was a business. You might have dressed it up in religious language and legal procedure, but at the end of the day, you were essentially a freelance executioner who got paid per kill. The economics of witch hunting were surprisingly complex. Local authorities would hire you because they needed someone to blame for their problems, crop failures, livestock deaths, mysterious illnesses, or just general social unrest. Rather than address the real causes: poverty, poor sanitation, bad governance, they'd pay you to find scapegoats. Your fee structure was usually based on results. You might get a small retainer up front, but the real money came from successful prosecutions. 50 crowns for a conviction, 100 for an execution, plus expenses for travel, lodging, and equipment. The more witches you found, the more you earned. This created a perverse incentive system. You weren't motivated to be careful or thorough in your investigations. You were motivated to find as many witches as possible, as quickly as possible. Justice wasn't the goal. Productivity was. But getting paid was often harder than earning the money. Local authorities were notorious for being slow with payments, especially after they'd seen what your methods actually involved. They'd hire you to solve their witch problem, then act shocked and appalled when you actually did what they'd hired you to do. You'd submit your bill, services rendered, investigation, arrest, trial, and execution of 3 witches, total 300 crowns plus expenses, and then you'd wait. And wait. And wait. Sometimes they'd try to negotiate down your fees after the fact. Well, one of those women wasn't really a witch, she was just crazy. So we shouldn't have to pay the full rate, as if the distinction mattered to the dead woman. Other times, they'd find excuses not to pay at all. The trials were irregular. You used excessive force. The evidence was questionable. Suddenly, the same people who'd begged you to come solve their witch problem were questioning your methods and refusing to pay your invoices. You learned quickly to demand payment up front or to seize property from the accused to cover your fees. The witch's house, her livestock, her possessions, everything became fair game. This had the added benefit of ensuring you always got paid, but it also meant you had a financial incentive to target people with property worth taking. Travel expenses were another constant source of conflict. You'd rack up bills for horses, lodging, meals, and equipment. But local authorities always seemed surprised by the total. You stayed in the expensive inn? You ate meat every day? You bought that many torture devices? The irregular income made long-term planning impossible. You might make a fortune one month by uncovering a witch conspiracy in a prosperous town, then go months without work because word had spread about your methods and no one wanted to hire you. And the money never felt clean. Every coin was paid for with someone's blood. Every comfortable meal was purchased with someone's screams. Every new piece of equipment was bought with the proceeds from judicial murder. The worst part was that you needed the money. This wasn't noble work you did for the good of your soul. It was a job that paid the bills. You had to eat, had to maintain your equipment, had to travel from town to town. The more successful you were at destroying lives, the better you lived. So you learned to ignore the source of your income, to think of it as payment for services rendered rather than blood money. You were a professional, providing a valuable service to communities plagued by supernatural threats. The fact that you were also a monster was just an unfortunate side effect of the job. But the coins always felt heavier than they should have, and the sound they made when you counted them always reminded you of the sounds your victims made when they died. Now let's discuss the career advancement opportunities in witch hunting, which were roughly equivalent to those available in pyramid schemes or organized crime. There wasn't exactly a corporate ladder to climb, but there were ways to improve your station, assuming you could live with yourself long enough to benefit from them. Entry-level witch hunters were essentially freelance contractors, traveling from town to town looking for work. You'd hear about a witch problem somewhere, show up uninvited, and offer your services. Sometimes you'd be hired. Sometimes you'd be run out of town by people who'd heard about your methods from the last place you'd worked. The successful hunters eventually built reputations. Word would spread about your efficiency, your high conviction rate, your ability to extract confessions from the most stubborn suspects. Suddenly, instead of having to seek out work, local authorities would seek you out. They'd send messengers to invite you to investigate their witch problems. This was when you could start demanding higher fees and better working conditions. Instead of sleeping in barns or under hedges, you'd be put up in the local manor house. Instead of begging for equipment loans, you'd have your own traveling torture kit. Instead of working alone, you'd have assistants and guards assigned to help you. The most successful witch hunters eventually attracted the attention of higher authorities. Bishops, nobles, even royal courts would hire you for particularly sensitive cases. The pay was better, the accommodations were luxurious, and the social status was significantly higher. You weren't just some itinerant torturer anymore. You were a professional consultor on supernatural threats. Some hunters even managed to secure permanent positions. A duke might keep you on retainer to handle all supernatural threats in his territory. A bishop might appoint you as his official inquisitor for a particular region. These jobs came with steady salaries, official titles, and a level of respect that freelance hunters could never achieve. But career advancement came with its own problems. The higher you rose, the more scrutinized your methods became. High-profile cases attracted attention from theologians, lawyers, and other intellectuals who might question your evidence or your procedures. You couldn't just torture someone into confessing anymore. You had to justify your methods to people who actually understood law and theology. The politics were also more complex. When you were working for peasant villages, your biggest concern was getting paid. When you were working for noble courts, you had to navigate complex webs of alliance and rivalry. Accusing the wrong person of witchcraft could end your career or your life. And success bred its own dangers. The more famous you became, the more enemies you made. The families of your victims didn't forget. The communities you terrorized held grudges. Other witch hunters saw you as competition. Even your employers might eventually decide you knew too much about their methods and become a liability. Some hunters tried to transition into related fields. You might become a professional inquisitor, focusing on heresy rather than witchcraft. Or you could move into secular law enforcement, using your interrogation skills to solve ordinary crimes. A few even became scholars, writing treatises on demonology or supernatural phenomena. But most witch hunters never really retired. They worked until they died, were killed, or burned out completely. The skills you learned, torture, intimidation, psychological manipulation, weren't easily transferable to normal professions. And the reputation you built for effectiveness was also a reputation for brutality that followed you everywhere. The tragic irony was that the more successful you became at your profession, the more isolated and hated you became as a human being. Career advancement in witch hunting meant becoming very good at something that made you fundamentally inhuman. And in the end, no amount of money or status could wash the blood from your hands or silence the screams that echoed in your dreams. Let's examine the delicate art of finding witches when there were no actual witches to find, which was essentially every case you worked on. This required a special combination of creativity, paranoia, and complete disregard for human life that separated the amateur accusers from the professional witch hunters. The key was understanding that witchcraft wasn't about what people actually did, it was about what you could convince others they had done. Reality was negotiable, evidence was flexible. Truth was whatever served your purposes. You'd start by studying the community dynamics. Who was unpopular? Who had made enemies? Who lived alone or differently from the rest? These were your prime candidates, not because they were actually practicing witchcraft, but because they were vulnerable and expendable. The old woman who lived alone with too many cats was perfect. Cats were associated with witchcraft, and her isolation meant fewer people would defend her. The midwife who delivered stillborn babies was another excellent target. When children died, someone had to be blamed, and who better than the person who was present at the death? Widows were particularly vulnerable. They often inherited property that other people wanted. They had no husbands to protect them, and their grief could be interpreted as unnatural behavior. A widow who mourned too long was clearly under demonic influence. One who recovered too quickly was obviously celebrating her freedom to practice witchcraft. Women who were too smart, too independent, or too outspoken were always suspicious. A woman who could read was probably reading forbidden books. One who gave medical advice was practicing unauthorized healing. One who argued with her husband was clearly being influenced by demons. But you couldn't just point at someone and shout witch. You needed to build a case, create a narrative that would convince the community that this person was indeed a supernatural threat. This required careful investigation, which meant talking to neighbors, gathering gossip, and encouraging people to remember strange incidents in a new light. That time the accused woman walked past someone's field and the crops failed a week later. Obviously, She cursed the field. The fact that it was the middle of a drought was irrelevant. The illness that struck a household after they'd refused to buy something from her. Clearly, supernatural revenge. The natural causes of the disease were beside the point. You'd encourage people to remember dreams they'd had about the accused. Dreams were considered supernatural communications, and a nightmare featuring your suspect was evidence of their psychic attacks. You'd ask leading questions. Didn't you feel strangely tired after speaking with her? Haven't you noticed your milk souring more often since she moved to town? Physical evidence was even easier to manufacture. Any unusual object found in the suspect's possession could be a magical implement. Dried herbs became potion ingredients. Unusual stones became scrying tools. Pet animals became demonic familiars. The devil's mark examination was particularly useful because you could always find something. Every human body has moles, scars, birthmarks, or unusual spots. With enough prodding and testing, you could declare any of these to be supernatural in origin. If physical evidence was lacking, you could always rely on spectral evidence. This was testimony about supernatural encounters that only the witness could see. Someone might claim they saw the accused's spirit flying through their window at night or transforming into an animal. The fact that no one else witnessed these events made them more believable, not less, because it showed the witness had special spiritual sensitivity. Confessions were the ultimate evidence, and you knew exactly how to get them. Start with sleep deprivation and isolation until the suspect was disoriented and desperate. Then add physical torture until they were willing to say anything to make it stop. Finally, provide them with a detailed script of what they needed to confess to, complete with names of accomplices and descriptions of Sabbath activities. The beautiful thing about this system was that it was self-reinforcing. Every confession provided new leads, new suspects, new opportunities for investigation. The accused would name their supposed accomplices under torture, and you'd arrest those people and torture them until they named others. A single accusation could mushroom into dozens of arrests and executions. And if anyone questioned your methods or your evidence, you had the perfect response. They were obviously being influenced by the devil themselves. Criticism of a witch hunt was proof of supernatural corruption. Demands for better evidence showed demonic manipulation. Calls for mercy revealed satanic sympathies. You weren't finding witches because there were no witches to find. You were creating witches, manufacturing evidence, and destroying lives to maintain the fiction that you were protecting the community from supernatural threats. But the community wanted to believe in your work because it gave them someone to blame for their problems and someone to fear who wasn't them. And you wanted to believe in your work because admitting the truth would mean facing the fact that you were nothing more than a professional murderer hiding behind religious authority. So the charade continued. The innocent died, and everyone pretended that justice was being served. Let's delve into the particularly twisted psychology of the witch hunter's mind, because you had to be fundamentally broken as a human being to do this job day after day. Normal people can't torture innocent individuals to death and sleep soundly at night. You had to develop a very special kind of mental armor to survive in this profession. First, you convinced yourself that you were doing God's work. Every arrest was a victory for righteousness. Every confession was a soul saved from damnation. Every execution was a blow against the forces of evil. The screams of your victims weren't cries of innocent suffering, they were demons being driven out. The tears of their families weren't grief for murdered loved ones, they were relief that the supernatural threat had been eliminated. This religious delusion was essential for your mental survival. You couldn't afford to see your victims as human beings with families, dreams, and hopes. They had to be monsters, supernatural threats, servants of Satan who deserved whatever happened to them. The moment you started seeing them as people, you'd realize what you actually were. But the religious justification only went so far. Deep down, you knew something was wrong. The evidence was always flimsy, the confessions were always extracted through torture, and the accused never seemed particularly supernatural until you made them confess to it. So you developed other psychological defenses. You told yourself that even if some of your victims were innocent of witchcraft, they were probably guilty of something else. The old woman you burned might not have been a witch, but she was surely a gossip or a troublemaker who deserved punishment. The midwife might not have killed babies through magic, but she was probably incompetent and deserved to die for her medical failures. You also developed a siege mentality. Everyone who criticized your methods was either naive about the supernatural threat or corrupted by it themselves. Other professionals who questioned your evidence were clearly influenced by demonic forces. Family members who defended the accused were probably witches too. The entire world was divided into those who supported your holy work and those who were aligned with evil. Paranoia became your constant companion. You saw signs of supernatural activity everywhere. A bird, flying in an unusual pattern, was clearly a witch in animal form. A sudden illness was obviously magical attack. Strange dreams were psychic assaults by your enemies. The more people you killed, the more enemies you imagined you had, both human and supernatural. You developed rituals to protect yourself from the revenge of your victims. Constant prayer, wearing protective amulets, carrying holy water, avoiding certain foods or activities that might make you vulnerable to magical attack. Your entire life became organized around the fantasy that you were under constant supernatural siege. The isolation was crushing. You couldn't have normal relationships because you saw potential witches everywhere. You couldn't trust anyone completely because they might be corrupted by demonic influence. You couldn't retire because the enemies you'd made would never stop hunting you. Your job became your entire identity, consuming everything else you might have been. And yet, despite all these psychological defenses, the doubt never completely went away. In quiet moments, when you were alone with your thoughts, you'd remember the face of some victim who'd maintained their innocence even while burning. You'd wonder if maybe, just maybe, you'd made a mistake. But these thoughts were too dangerous to pursue, so you'd push them down and focus on your next case. The really sick part was that the longer you did the job, the better you got at it. You learned to read people, to manipulate their fears, to extract confessions more efficiently. You became a master of psychological torture, able to break almost anyone given enough time and the right techniques. Your skill at destroying human beings became something you took professional pride in. Eventually, you stopped being a person who happened to hunt witches and became a witch hunter who happened to be a person. The job consumed your identity so completely that you couldn't imagine existing without it. You were trapped in a profession that required you to be a monster, and the longer you stayed, the more monstrous you became. And the most terrifying part? You probably started to enjoy it. The power, the fear you inspired, the moment when someone finally broke and confessed to whatever you wanted them to say. You became addicted to the rush of absolute control over another human being's life and death. By the end, you weren't hunting witches anymore. You were hunting yourself, trying to stay one step ahead of the growing realization that you had become the very evil you claimed to fight against. Now let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, which was surprisingly often for a profession that was supposed to be backed by divine authority. Witch hunting was a high-risk job, not because you were actually fighting supernatural forces, but because you were essentially committing serial murder with a very thin veneer of legal protection. Sometimes your victims had family members who didn't appreciate seeing their loved ones tortured to death. These people might seek revenge, and they weren't always polite about it. You could wake up to find your horse dead, your equipment destroyed, or yourself on the wrong end of a knife wielded by someone who blamed you for burning their mother. Local authorities could turn on you quickly if public opinion shifted. The same officials who hired you to solve their witch problem might throw you to the wolves if the community decided your methods were too extreme. One day, you're a respected professional. The next day, you're a liability they need to distance themselves from. Political changes were particularly dangerous. A new bishop might disapprove of your theological interpretations. A new lord might question your legal authority. A new king might decide that witch hunting was bad for the realm's reputation. Suddenly, the protection you thought you had would evaporate, leaving you exposed to prosecution for the very crimes you'd been commissioned to commit. Other witch hunters were also a constant threat. This was a competitive field, and rivals might try to eliminate the competition by accusing you of witchcraft yourself. After all, who better to serve as a witch than someone who knew all the secrets of the supernatural world? Your expertise could be reframed as evidence that you were working for the other side. The church could be fickle in its support. While official doctrine supported the existence of witches and the need to eliminate them, individual clergy members might object to your methods or question your authority. A reform-minded priest could make your life very difficult by preaching against torture or encouraging his congregation to demand better evidence for accusations. Legal challenges were becoming more common as the centuries progressed. Educated lawyers and scholars were starting to question the evidentiary standards used in witch trials. They might demand corroborating witnesses, challenge the validity of confessions extracted under torture, or argue that spectral evidence was insufficient for conviction. These intellectual attacks on your methods were harder to counter than physical threats. Sometimes you'd simply pick the wrong target. Accusing a nobleman's relative, a wealthy merchant's wife, or a popular local figure could backfire spectacularly. These people had resources and connections you couldn't match. They could hire lawyers, call in favors, or simply use their wealth and status to turn the community against you. Medical knowledge was slowly advancing, and some of the phenomena you attributed to witchcraft were starting to be understood as natural diseases or psychological conditions. A doctor might challenge your diagnosis of supernatural possession, arguing that the victim was suffering from a known medical condition that could be treated without burning anyone alive. Public opinion was shifting gradually. People were becoming more skeptical of witch hunter claims, more aware of the potential for abuse, and more disturbed by the spectacle of mass executions. Communities that had once welcomed you as a protector might now see you as a threat to social stability. And then there were the personal costs. The constant stress, the paranoia, the isolation, and the guilt would eventually take their toll. Some witch hunters suffered mental breakdowns, turning to alcohol or developing obsessive behaviors. Others became so paranoid that they stopped functioning effectively, seeing conspiracies everywhere and trusting no one. Your reputation could also become a burden. Being known as an effective witch hunter meant that every unexplained death, crop failure, or strange occurrence in your vicinity would be blamed on supernatural revenge against you. People would avoid you, not out of respect, but out of fear that associating with you would make them targets for witchcraft. The job had no exit strategy. You couldn't just retire and open a bakery somewhere. Your skills weren't transferable to normal employment. Your reputation preceded you everywhere, and the enemies you'd made didn't forget. You were trapped in a profession that was slowly destroying you, with no way out except death. And sometimes, the cosmic irony would come full circle. You'd find yourself accused of witchcraft, facing the same procedures you'd used on countless others. Your expertise in the field would be used as evidence against you. Your knowledge of diabolic practices would be interpreted as proof that you'd been serving Satan all along. When witch hunters fell, they fell hard, and the same communities that had once praised their work would cheer just as loudly for their destruction. Let's examine the bureaucratic nightmare that was medieval witch hunting administration, because yes, even systematic murder required paperwork. As a witch hunter, You weren't just a torturer and executioner, you were also a record keeper, accountant, and legal administrator dealing with some of the most complex and contradictory procedures in medieval law. Every case required extensive documentation. You had to record the initial accusation, noting who made it, when, and under what circumstances. Then came witness testimonies, which had to be written down in precise legal language, translated from local dialects into Latin, and verified by multiple sources. Each piece of evidence had to be catalogued, described in detail, and properly preserved. The interrogation transcripts were particularly complex. You had to record not just what the accused said, but how they said it, what torture methods were used, and how they responded to each technique. These records would be reviewed by higher authorities, so they had to be detailed enough to justify your methods while being vague enough to avoid admitting to anything too obviously illegal. Confession documents were elaborate affairs that required careful legal drafting. They had to include specific admissions of guilt, detailed descriptions of supernatural activities, and lists of accomplices. The language had to be theologically correct, legally binding, and dramatic enough to justify the death sentence. Many witch hunters employed scribes specifically for this purpose because the paperwork was so complex. Financial records were another constant headache. You had to track your expenses, submit invoices to local authorities, and often fight for payment. Every meal, every night's lodging, every torture device, every bribe paid to informants had to be documented and justified. Local officials were notorious for questioning expenses after the fact, claiming that certain costs were unnecessary or excessive. Correspondence was endless. You had to write reports to bishops, nobles, and other authorities explaining your progress and requesting additional support. You had to respond to inquiries from other regions asking about your methods or requesting advice on their own witch problems. You had to maintain relationships with a network of contacts who might provide future employment opportunities. Legal appeals were becoming more common and more complex. Families of the accused might petition higher authorities for clemency or review. Other legal professionals might challenge your procedures or evidence. Each appeal required detailed responses, supporting documentation, and often additional witness testimony. These legal battles could drag on for months or years. Property seizure records were particularly important because they affected your payment. When you arrested someone for witchcraft, their possessions often became forfeit to pay for the trial and execution. You had to inventory everything of value, arrange for its sale or distribution, and ensure that your fees were paid before other creditors made claims. Travel permits and official commissions had to be renewed regularly. Your authority to operate in different regions came from various bishops, nobles, or royal officials, and these authorizations had expiration dates. Keeping your credentials current required constant correspondence and occasional visits to renew your permits in person. Equipment maintenance logs were essential for tax purposes and expense reimbursement. Your torture devices, transportation, and other professional equipment had to be maintained, repaired, and occasionally replaced. Local authorities wanted detailed records of these expenses before they'd approve reimbursement. Case outcome reports were required by the various authorities who employed you. They wanted to know how many witches you'd identified, how many confessions you'd obtained, how many executions you'd carried out, and how much it had all cost. These reports were used to evaluate your effectiveness and determine whether to hire you for future cases. The worst part was that different jurisdictions had different requirements for documentation. What passed for adequate records in one region might be completely unacceptable in another. You had to maintain multiple filing systems and adapt your record-keeping to satisfy various legal traditions and bureaucratic preferences. And then there were the security concerns. These documents contained sensitive information that could be used against you if they fell into the wrong hands. Detailed descriptions of your torture methods, lists of informants, financial records showing questionable expenses, all of this had to be kept secure while remaining accessible for official review. The paperwork was so overwhelming that successful witch hunters often employed entire staffs of clerks, scribes, and accountants just to handle the administrative burden. What started as a simple matter of identifying and eliminating witches had evolved into a complex bureaucratic enterprise that generated more paper than bodies. And the cruel irony was that all this careful documentation, meant to provide legal cover for your activities, often became evidence against you when public opinion shifted. The same detailed records you'd created to justify your work could be used to prosecute you for murder, torture, and corruption. The pen, it turned out, was not mightier than the sword, but it was definitely more incriminating. Now let's discuss the awkward reality of being a witch hunter during the slow dawn of scientific reasoning, when educated people were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about your methods and evidence. The Renaissance was bringing new ideas about proof, observation, and rational inquiry that made your job significantly more difficult. Physicians were beginning to understand that many of the symptoms you attributed to witchcraft were actually caused by natural diseases. That woman you claimed was possessed by demons? A doctor might diagnose her with epilepsy or hysteria and offer medical treatment instead of execution. Suddenly, your supernatural explanation was competing with a natural one that didn't require burning anyone alive. Lawyers trained in Roman law were questioning your legal procedures. They wanted corroborating evidence, credible witnesses, and logical proof of guilt. The idea that torture-extracted confessions might be unreliable was gaining ground among legal scholars. Some were even arguing that spectral evidence shouldn't be admissible in court because ghosts couldn't be cross-examined. Natural philosophers were developing new theories about the physical world that left less room for supernatural intervention. If lightning was caused by atmospheric conditions rather than God's wrath, maybe other phenomena you attributed to witchcraft also had natural explanations. Every scientific discovery chipped away at the worldview that made your profession possible. The printing press was spreading these new ideas faster than you could suppress them. Books questioning the reality of witchcraft were circulating among educated elites. Skeptical treatises were being translated into local languages and distributed beyond university circles. The intellectual foundation for witch hunting was being undermined by the spread of literacy and knowledge. Theological scholars were re-examining the biblical and doctrinal basis for your work. Some argued that the Bible's references to witches were mistranslated or referred to different practices than what you were prosecuting. Others questioned whether the church had the authority to execute people for supernatural crimes that might not actually exist. Mathematical thinkers were applying probability theory to your evidence. They pointed out that in communities where you found dozens of witches, the odds of so many people simultaneously deciding to serve Satan were astronomically low. Statistical analysis suggested that either your region was uniquely evil or your methods were fundamentally flawed. Merchants and traders who traveled widely were noting that witch hunting seemed to be more common in some regions than others, and that the pattern didn't correlate with apparent levels of supernatural activity. Areas with aggressive witch hunters had more witches, while areas without witch hunters seemed to suffer no more from supernatural problems. Political theorists were questioning whether the mass execution of citizens was compatible with good governance. They argued that communities ravaged by witch hunts became less stable and prosperous, not more. The economic costs of losing productive citizens to execution were starting to outweigh the supposed benefits of supernatural protection. Reformed religious movements were challenging the authority of traditional church hierarchy to define and prosecute supernatural crimes. Protestant reformers particularly questioned whether Catholic inquisitorial procedures were theologically sound or practically effective. But perhaps most dangerously, some observers were starting to notice patterns in your work. They pointed out that accused witches were disproportionately women, poor, elderly, or otherwise marginalized. They noted that witch hunting seemed to increase during times of social stress and decrease during periods of prosperity. These observations suggested that supernatural explanations might be less important than social and economic factors. You found yourself having to defend not just individual cases, but the entire intellectual framework that made your profession possible. Instead of simply proving that specific people were witches, you had to argue that witches existed at all, that they posed real threats, and that your methods were the appropriate response. These intellectual challenges forced you to become more sophisticated in your approach. You had to learn enough theology, law, medicine, and natural philosophy to counter the arguments of your critics. This educational requirement made the profession less accessible to simple-minded thugs and more dependent on educated professionals who understood the debates they were entering. But the more you learned about these competing explanations for the phenomena you attributed to witchcraft, the harder it became to maintain your certainty. Knowledge, it turned out, was the enemy of witch hunting. The more people understood about the natural world, the less room there was for your supernatural explanations. You were fighting a losing battle against the advance of human understanding. Every scientific discovery, every medical breakthrough, every legal reform made your job a little harder and your justifications a little thinner. And deep down, you probably knew that progress was not on your side. Let's examine the social dynamics of the communities you worked in, because witch hunting wasn't just about individual accusations. It was about entire communities tearing themselves apart in orgies of suspicion, betrayal, and violence that you orchestrated and profited from. When you arrived in a town, you didn't just bring your torture equipment and legal documents, you brought paranoia. Your very presence changed the social atmosphere, turning neighbors into potential enemies and friends into suspicious strangers. Everyone knew that someone was going to be accused, tortured, and probably executed. They just didn't know who. The fear was immediate and pervasive. People started watching each other more carefully, looking for signs of supernatural activity or unusual behavior. Conversations became guarded. Social gatherings grew tense. Children were warned to be careful what they said and to whom they said it. You encouraged this atmosphere of suspicion because it made your job easier. Scared people were more likely to report unusual behavior, more willing to believe accusations, and more eager to see someone punished for their community's problems. Fear was your most valuable tool, more effective than any torture device. The accusations usually started with the most vulnerable members of the community: the old widow who lived alone, the foreign woman who spoke with an accent, the mentally ill person who talked to themselves. These people had few defenders and many enemies, making them easy targets for frustrated neighbors looking for someone to blame. But the real damage came when the torture began and names were extracted from the accused. Under extreme pain, victims would confess to attending witch sabbaths and would be forced to name their supposed accomplices. These names became your next round of arrests, spreading the terror through the community like a disease. The social fabric began to unravel as friends accused friends, neighbors turned against neighbors, and family members found themselves on opposite sides of supernatural accusations. Trust became impossible when anyone might be secretly practicing witchcraft or secretly planning to accuse you of practicing witchcraft. Economic relationships collapsed as people refused to do business with suspected witches or their families. Social gatherings stopped because no one wanted to be seen associating with the wrong people. Marriages were postponed or canceled if either family was touched by suspicion. The community's normal functions ground to a halt. Children were particularly affected by the atmosphere of terror. They were encouraged to report unusual behavior by adults, including their own parents. Some communities offered rewards for information about witchcraft, turning children into paid informants against their own families. The psychological damage to young people who lived through witch hunts was severe and long-lasting. Religious life became twisted as people tried to prove their Christian piety by being especially vigorous in supporting your work. Church attendance soared, but not out of genuine faith. People were trying to establish alibis, demonstrate their orthodoxy, and avoid being seen as insufficiently enthusiastic about the witch hunt. The local economy suffered as productive members of the community were arrested, executed, or fled. Women who served as midwives, healers, or herbalists were particularly likely to be accused, depriving the community of essential services. Fear of accusation also discouraged innovation or unusual practices that might attract suspicion. Leadership structures broke down as local officials either supported your work and became complicit in murder, or opposed it and risked being accused themselves. Many communities lost their natural leaders to execution or exile, leaving them rudderless and traumatized. The psychological toll was enormous. Entire populations developed symptoms we'd now recognize as mass hysteria or collective trauma. People reported seeing supernatural phenomena, experiencing mysterious illnesses, or feeling under psychic attack. The line between reality and fantasy blurred as the community's shared delusion grew stronger. But perhaps the most insidious effect was how witch hunting changed people's fundamental assumptions about human nature and social relationships. In a community that had experienced a witch hunt, people never quite trusted each other the same way again. The knowledge that neighbors could turn murderous under the right circumstances left permanent scars on the social fabric. Some communities never recovered from the trauma of witch hunting. They remained suspicious, divided, and economically depressed for generations. The social capital that had made community life possible was destroyed and couldn't easily be rebuilt. And you, the witch hunter, were the catalyst for all this destruction. You didn't just kill individuals, you murdered communities, destroying the bonds of trust and mutual support that made civilization possible. The communities that hired you thought they were purchasing protection from supernatural threats. What they actually bought was the systematic destruction of everything that made them a community in the first place. Let's delve into the particularly gruesome world of witch hunting equipment and techniques, because your success as a professional torturer depended on having the right tools and knowing how to use them with maximum effectiveness and minimum efficiency. Your portable torture kit was like a medieval Swiss Army knife designed by someone with serious psychological issues. Everything had to be compact enough to transport from town to town, versatile enough to handle different types of suspects, and intimidating enough to break people's will before you even started using them. The bodkin was your most essential tool. This long, thin needle was used to search for devil's marks on the accused's body. You'd strip the suspect naked and systematically probe every mole, scar, or blemish looking for spots that didn't bleed or feel pain. The technique was to jab quickly and firmly, watching for reactions. Any spot that seemed less sensitive than others was obviously supernatural in origin. Of course, with enough poking, you could make any area seem insensitive. The trick was to vary the pressure and speed of your probing, sometimes pressing hard enough to cause real pain, sometimes barely touching the skin. This inconsistency would confuse the suspect about what they were supposed to feel, making it easier to declare certain spots to be devil's marks. Scales were necessary for the water test and weight examinations. Witches were supposed to weigh less than normal people because of their supernatural abilities, so you'd weigh suspects and compare them to other people of similar build. The fact that fear, poor nutrition, and stress might make someone underweight was irrelevant. Lightness was evidence of guilt. The water test required specialized equipment: ropes for binding, stones for weighing down, and boats for retrieving the results. You'd tie the suspect's thumbs to their toes, attach a rope, and throw them into deep water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. Either way, the problem was solved. Restraint devices were essential for interrogation sessions. Thumbscrews were compact and effective, applying concentrated pressure to a small area while leaving the victim able to speak clearly. The pain was excruciating, but not immediately life-threatening, allowing for extended questioning sessions. Leg irons and manacles kept suspects immobilized during transport and imprisonment. But these weren't just practical restraints, they were psychological weapons. The weight and discomfort of iron shackles reminded prisoners constantly of their helpless situation and your complete control over their lives. The strappato required more elaborate equipment, but was devastatingly effective. You needed pulleys, ropes, and a high ceiling or tree branch. The suspect's hands would be tied behind their back. Then they'd be hoisted into the air by their arms. The shoulders would dislocate almost immediately, accompanied by distinctive popping sounds and screams that could be heard through stone walls. For added effect, you could attach weights to the victim's feet or drop them suddenly and catch them just before they hit the ground. The anticipation of falling was almost as effective as the actual impact, and the repeated dislocation of joints would permanently cripple most victims. Fire was always available, but required careful management. Branding irons had to be heated to the right temperature, hot enough to sear flesh, but not so hot that they'd kill the victim immediately. The smell of heating metal was often as effective as the actual branding, and you'd make sure suspects could see and hear the irons being prepared. Candles and torches could be used for more precise burning, applying heat to fingertips, genitals, or other sensitive areas. The advantage of fire was its versatility. You could control exactly how much damage you inflicted and where you inflicted it. Water torture came in several varieties, each requiring different equipment. The simplest version involved forcing large quantities of water down the victim's throat using a funnel, causing them to feel like they were drowning from the inside. More elaborate setups involve strapping the victim to an inclined board and pouring water over their face through cloth, creating the sensation of drowning while keeping them alive. Cutting tools had to be sharp and precise. You didn't want to accidentally kill someone before they'd confessed, but the threat of mutilation was extremely effective. Small knives could be used to remove fingernails, slice ears, or make precise cuts that would heal slowly and painfully. The psychological tools were just as important as the physical ones. Masks, hoods, and blindfolds intensified the victim's sense of helplessness and uncertainty. When they couldn't see what was happening, their imagination often created worse scenarios than reality. Sound effects were crucial for maintaining the atmosphere of terror. The grinding of metal being sharpened, the hiss of water on hot coals, the screams of other prisoners being tortured in nearby cells, all of these contributed to the psychological pressure on your current subject. Documentation tools were necessary for recording confessions and maintaining legal records, but they also served as psychological weapons. The sight of scribes carefully writing down everything the victim said made their words seem more permanent and significant, encouraging them to say whatever they thought you wanted to hear. Your equipment had to be maintained constantly. Torture devices needed cleaning, sharpening, and repair. Ropes rotted, metal corroded, and leather cracked. The practical demands of maintaining a mobile torture operation were surprisingly complex and expensive. But the most important tool was your voice. The right tone could be more effective than any physical device. You learned to modulate between gentle encouragement and terrifying threats, creating an atmosphere where confession seemed like the only escape from an impossible situation. Your toolkit wasn't just a collection of devices, it was a carefully designed system for breaking human beings efficiently and extractively. And every tool in it was paid for with the screams of innocent people who died to justify your profession. Now let's explore the legal maze that was medieval jurisprudence regarding witchcraft. because you had to navigate a complex web of canon law, civil law, local customs, and royal decrees, all while trying to maintain the fiction that what you were doing was actually legal. The legal foundation for witch hunting was surprisingly shaky, built on a patchwork of biblical interpretation, ancient Roman law, medieval church doctrine, and local traditions that often contradicted each other. Different jurisdictions had different rules, different authorities had different opinions, and the whole system was constantly evolving as new cases created new precedents. Canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, provided the theological justification for prosecuting witchcraft. The Church had declared witchcraft to be heresy, which made it a crime against God that warranted earthly punishment. But canon law also required specific procedures for trying heretics, including multiple witnesses, careful examination of evidence, and opportunities for repentance. The problem was that most communities that hired you didn't want to follow these careful procedures. They wanted quick results, not theological debates. So you learned to cherry-pick the parts of canon law that supported your methods while ignoring the parts that might slow down or complicate your work. Civil law varied enormously from region to region. Some areas had specific statutes defining witchcraft as a capital crime. Others relied on general laws against murder, assault, or disturbing the peace. Still, others had no relevant laws at all, forcing you to operate in legal gray areas where your authority was questionable at best. Royal law added another layer of complexity. Kings and princes might issue decrees supporting or restricting witch hunting, depending on their religious beliefs, political needs, or personal experiences. A new ruler might completely change the legal landscape, making previously acceptable practices suddenly illegal. Local customs were often the most important factor in determining what you could and couldn't do. Communities that had experienced successful witch hunts in the past were more likely to accept aggressive methods. Areas with strong traditions of legal procedure might demand more evidence and better documentation. The concept of jurisdiction was constantly problematic. Who had the authority to authorize a witch hunt? Could a local lord commission you to operate in his territory? Did you need approval from the regional bishop? What about royal officials or civil magistrates? Often, multiple authorities claimed jurisdiction over the same case, leading to conflicts that could derail your entire operation. Evidence standards were another constant source of confusion. What constituted proof of witchcraft? Confession was generally accepted, but what about confessions extracted under torture? Witness testimony was valuable, but what about spectral evidence or supernatural visions? Physical evidence was preferable, but how do you prove that an object is magical rather than ordinary? The rights of the accused were minimally defined and rarely respected. In theory, suspects were entitled to legal representation, the opportunity to present evidence in their defense, and protection from excessive torture. In practice, these rights were easily waived or ignored when dealing with supernatural crimes. Appeals processes existed but were cumbersome and often ineffective. A family member might petition a higher authority for clemency or review, but these appeals took months or years to process, while executions happened within days of conviction. By the time an appeal was heard, the appellant was usually dead. Property rights were particularly complex because witchcraft convictions often resulted in forfeiture of the accused's possessions. But who got the property? The court that tried the case? The authority that commissioned the witch hunt? The community that was protected from the supernatural threat? These disputes could drag on for years and sometimes became more contentious than the original witchcraft case. International law was virtually non-existent, but witchcraft cases sometimes crossed borders. If a suspected witch fled to another jurisdiction, could you pursue them? Did foreign authorities have to honor your warrants? What if different countries had different laws about witchcraft? These cross-border issues were rarely resolved satisfactorily. The most problematic aspect of witchcraft law was that it required proving the existence of supernatural phenomena in a legal system designed for natural evidence. How do you cross-examine a demon? How do you verify that someone actually flew to a Sabbath? How do you distinguish between real magic and coincidence? Legal scholars were increasingly uncomfortable with these problems, and some began arguing that witchcraft cases should be held to the same evidentiary standards as other crimes. This threatened the foundation of your profession, because applying normal legal standards to supernatural accusations would make convictions virtually impossible. You learned to work within this legal chaos by developing relationships with sympathetic authorities, avoiding jurisdictions with strict procedural requirements, and timing your operations to coincide with political situations that favored aggressive action against supposed supernatural threats. But the legal inconsistencies that made your work possible also made it dangerous. What was legal in one place might be murder in another. A technique that was accepted procedure under one authority might be grounds for prosecution under another. You were constantly operating on the edge of legal disaster, protected only by the fear and superstition of the communities that employed you. And as legal systems became more sophisticated and standardized, the protection you enjoyed became thinner and more precarious. The same intellectual developments that threatened your theological justifications also undermined your legal authority. You were fighting a losing battle against the rule of law itself. Let's examine the international scope of your profession, because witch hunting wasn't just a local phenomenon. It was a continent-wide epidemic that you could follow from country to country, adapting your methods to different legal systems, languages, and cultural traditions. The techniques you learned in the Holy Roman Empire could be exported to France, Spain, Scotland, or Poland with minor modifications. Different regions had different preferred torture methods, different legal procedures, and different theological emphasis, but the basic principles of hunting witches remained remarkably consistent across Europe. Germany was perhaps the most fertile ground for witch hunting, with its fragmented political structure and intense religious conflicts. The hundreds of small principalities, bishoprics, and free cities meant that legal authority was divided and often competitive. Prince-bishops vied with secular rulers to demonstrate their religious zeal through aggressive persecution of supernatural threats. In Germany, you could work for multiple employers simultaneously, moving between jurisdictions as cases developed. The famous Würzburg and Bamberg witch hunts demonstrated how productive this environment could be, with hundreds of executions carried out over several years by teams of professional hunters working with local authorities. France offered different opportunities, with its more centralized legal system and strong royal authority. The Parliament of Paris became increasingly skeptical of witch hunting as the Renaissance progressed, requiring more sophisticated legal arguments and better documentation. But provincial areas remained more receptive to traditional methods. Spain presented unique challenges due to the Inquisition's monopoly on religious crimes. The Spanish inquisitors were generally more cautious about witchcraft accusations than secular authorities, requiring extensive investigation and documentation before proceeding with trials. This created opportunities for freelance hunters willing to work within the Inquisition's procedures, but it also meant that operations took longer and faced more scrutiny. Scotland was notoriously brutal in its approach to witchcraft, with King James VI personally involved in promoting aggressive persecution. Scottish law allowed for more extensive use of torture than most other jurisdictions, and Scottish courts were remarkably willing to accept spectral evidence and forced confessions. England was more restrictive, with common law traditions that limited the use of torture and required higher standards of evidence. But English law also allowed for accusations of maleficium, harmful magic, that could be proven through natural evidence of damage or injury, creating different strategic approaches for witch hunters. Poland and Hungary offered vast territories with weak central authority and strong local traditions of folk magic beliefs. These regions could support extended campaigns involving hundreds of suspects and multiple communities simultaneously. The techniques you learned had to be adapted to local conditions. Different regions had different ideas about what constituted evidence of witchcraft, different torture methods that were considered acceptable, and different legal procedures that had to be followed. Language barriers required you to work with local translators and scribes who understood the legal terminology and cultural references necessary for effective witch hunting. Confession scripts had to be adapted to local folklore and religious traditions. Religious differences also mattered. Catholic regions emphasized the sacramental aspects of witchcraft and the role of the devil in corrupting souls. Protestant areas focused more on God's sovereignty and the need to eliminate evil from godly communities. Orthodox regions had their own theological emphases and legal traditions. Payment methods varied significantly between regions. Some areas paid in coin, others in land grants or tax exemptions. Some contracts were with individual nobles, others with church authorities, and still others with municipal governments. Understanding the local economy and payment customs was essential for maintaining profitability. Competition between witch hunters was international in scope. Successful hunters in one region would attract attention from authorities in other areas looking for experienced professionals. But reputation also traveled, and communities that had negative experiences with particular hunters would warn others about their methods or reliability. The flow of information about techniques, legal precedents, and successful strategies was surprisingly rapid across Europe. Letters between authorities, academic correspondence, and published treatises spread innovations in witch hunting methodology throughout the continent within months or years. But international operations also created new risks. Working in unfamiliar jurisdictions meant operating without local knowledge or protection. Political changes in one region could affect your reputation and employability in others. Wars and diplomatic conflicts could disrupt established networks and force hasty relocations. Some witch hunters specialized in particular regions or types of cases, developing expertise in local conditions and building long-term relationships with authorities. Others remained mobile, following opportunities across the continent as they arose. The most successful hunters often worked as part of networks, sharing information, referring cases to colleagues, and coordinating activities across multiple jurisdictions. These informal professional associations provided mutual support and protection in a dangerous and unpredictable field. But ultimately, your success depended on your ability to adapt to local conditions while maintaining the core skills that made you effective: the ability to manufacture evidence, extract confessions, and convince communities that you were protecting them from supernatural threats. The witch hunting epidemic was truly international in scope, and you were part of a continent-wide network of professional torturers and murderers who had learned to disguise their crimes as religious service. Now let's delve into the economics of fear, because witch hunting wasn't just about religious paranoia, it was also about money, property, and the profitable business of manufacturing supernatural threats to extract resources from terrified communities. The business model was elegant in its simplicity. Create a problem that only you could solve, then charge premium rates for the solution. Communities facing crop failures, livestock deaths, unexplained illnesses, or general social unrest needed someone to blame. You provided that someone, complete with legal justification and religious authority. Your fee structure was designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. You'd typically charge a retainer up front to cover initial expenses, then collect additional payments based on results. 50 crowns for identifying a witch, 100 for securing a confession, 200 for a successful execution, plus expenses, of course. But the real money was in the property seizures. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their possessions were usually forfeit to pay for the trial and execution. Houses, livestock, tools, savings, jewelry, everything became available for auction or direct appropriation. As the witch hunter, you were typically entitled to a percentage of the seized assets. This created powerful incentives to target people with property rather than focusing on actual evidence of supernatural activity. The poor widow with 7 cats might be an obvious suspect, but the prosperous merchant's wife with a house full of valuable goods was a much more attractive target financially. You learn to research the economic status of potential suspects before making accusations. Property records, tax assessments, and local gossip about wealth all factored into your targeting decisions. Why burn a pauper when you could burn a property owner and get paid for it? The seizure process was often more lucrative than your official fees. Furniture, tools, livestock, and land could be acquired at below-market prices through forced sales to pay legal costs. You and your associates could bid on these assets with inside knowledge of their value and condition. Some witch hunters developed side businesses around their primary profession. You might establish relationships with merchants who would buy seized goods for resale in other markets. Or you could invest in property development, using confiscated land for new construction projects. The multiplier effect was significant. Each successful case generated not only direct income, but also enhanced your reputation, leading to more contracts and higher fees. A witch hunter with a track record of successful prosecutions could command premium rates and better working conditions. But you also had significant expenses that ate into your profits. Transportation, lodging, equipment maintenance, bribes to informants, and payments to assistants all reduced your net income. The torture devices and legal documents necessary for professional witch hunting represented substantial capital investments. Personnel costs were particularly high because you needed trustworthy associates who could handle the psychological demands of the work. Competent torturers, reliable scribes, and discreet informants all commanded premium wages because of the specialized skills required. Insurance was non-existent, but risk management was essential. You had to maintain reserve funds to handle legal challenges, escape costs if operations went wrong, and protection payments to ensure your own safety. A single case that backfired could wipe out months of profits. The economic cycles of witch hunting were tied to broader social and economic conditions. Periods of hardship, failed harvests, or political instability created demand for your services. Prosperous times with stable social conditions made communities less interested in finding supernatural scapegoats. Seasonal patterns also affected your business. Spring planting and fall harvest seasons were often busy times as agricultural communities dealt with anxiety about crop success. Winter months provided opportunities for indoor trials and interrogations when people had more time for legal proceedings. Competition from other witch hunters could drive down prices and force you to accept lower quality contracts. Established hunters with strong reputations could charge premium rates, while newcomers might have to work for subsistence wages until they built their own track records. Geographic factors influenced profitability significantly. Urban areas often had more wealth to seize, but also more sophisticated legal systems that made operations more complex. Rural regions might offer easier targets, but less valuable assets to confiscate. The relationship between witch hunting and other criminal enterprises was complex. Some hunters supplemented their income through blackmail, using their investigations to gather compromising information about community members. Others worked as general problem solvers for local authorities, handling various types of social control through intimidation and violence. Long-term financial planning was difficult because the profession had no retirement system and uncertain career longevity. Successful hunters might accumulate enough wealth to purchase land or invest in other businesses, but most worked until they died, were killed, or lost their ability to function effectively. The economic impact on communities was devastating. Witch hunts drained local resources through trial costs, property seizures, and the loss of productive community members. Areas that experienced intensive witch hunting often remained economically depressed for decades afterward. But from your perspective as a witch hunter, these broader economic effects were irrelevant. You were running a business, and business was good as long as people remained afraid of supernatural threats and willing to pay someone to eliminate them. The witch hunting economy was fundamentally parasitic, extracting wealth from communities while providing no real value in return. But it was also remarkably profitable for those willing to trade their humanity for financial success. Let's examine the gradual decline of your profession, because witch hunting didn't end with a dramatic revelation or royal decree. It slowly withered away as intellectual, legal, and social changes made your services less necessary and more dangerous to provide. The scientific revolution was your profession's slow-acting poison. Every natural explanation for previously mysterious phenomena reduced the market for supernatural interpretations. When people understood that disease was caused by bad air or contaminated water rather than curses, they were less likely to hire you to find the witch responsible for an outbreak. Medical advances were particularly damaging to your business model. Physicians could now diagnose and treat conditions that you had previously attributed to witchcraft. Epilepsy, mental illness, ergot poisoning, and various neurological disorders all had natural explanations that didn't require burning anyone alive. The legal profession was evolving in ways that made your methods increasingly unacceptable. Concepts like burden of proof, rules of evidence, and defendants' rights were spreading from civil courts to criminal proceedings. Torture-extracted confessions were becoming legally questionable rather than preferred evidence. Religious changes also undermined your theological justifications. Protestant reformers questioned many Catholic traditions surrounding supernatural intervention in daily life. Even within Catholicism, reform movements emphasized personal spirituality over institutional responses to supernatural threats. Economic factors reduced demand for your services as European societies became more prosperous and stable. Well-fed populations with secure livelihoods were less likely to believe that their problems were caused by supernatural enemies. Social tensions that had driven witch hunting were being resolved through other means. Political centralization eliminated many of the jurisdictional conflicts that had made witch hunting possible. Stronger royal authorities were less tolerant of local violence and more insistent on consistent legal procedures. The fragmented political landscape that had allowed you to shop for sympathetic jurisdictions was disappearing. Intellectual skepticism was becoming more respectable among educated elites. Scholars, lawyers, and clergy were openly questioning the reality of witchcraft and the effectiveness of traditional methods for combating it. These doubts filtered down to local authorities who employed witch hunters. The printing press spread skeptical literature faster than you could suppress it. Books questioning the existence of witches, criticizing torture-based legal procedures, and offering natural explanations for supernatural phenomena circulated widely and influenced public opinion. Competition from other explanations for social problems reduced your market share. Political reformers blamed bad governance for social ills. Economic theorists pointed to trade and fiscal policies. Medical professionals identified environmental causes of disease and social dysfunction. Professional organizations were developing ethical standards that excluded your methods. Legal associations, medical guilds, and clerical institutions were establishing codes of conduct that made participation in witch hunting professionally damaging rather than advantageous. Insurance and liability concerns made employment of witch hunters riskier for local authorities. Officials who commissioned aggressive persecution campaigns could face legal challenges, political repercussions, or financial liability for damages. The cost-benefit analysis was shifting against witch hunting. International pressure was increasing as major European powers moved away from witch hunting. Diplomatic relationships and trade partnerships were affected by reputation for barbaric legal practices. Communities that continued aggressive persecution risked isolation and economic sanctions. Generational change was perhaps the most important factor. Younger officials, clergy, and community leaders had different educational backgrounds and cultural assumptions than their predecessors. They were less likely to believe in supernatural threats and more likely to question traditional methods of social control. But the decline was uneven and incomplete. Rural areas remained more susceptible to witch hunting than urban centers. Regions with weak central authority or strong folk traditions continued to support traditional practices. Crisis situations could still trigger outbreaks of supernatural persecution. Some witch hunters adapted to changing conditions by modifying their methods or shifting to related fields. You might become a general criminal investigator, a political informant, or a religious counselor. Others attempted to defend traditional practices through improved documentation and more sophisticated theological arguments. The last major witch hunts occurred in peripheral regions with limited contact with mainstream European intellectual developments. Remote areas of Scotland, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe continued sporadic persecution into the 18th century. Individual witch hunters faced different fates as the profession declined. Some died naturally before the changes affected them. Others were prosecuted for their previous activities as legal standards evolved. A few managed to reinvent themselves in new careers, though always carrying the burden of their past actions. The institutional memory of witch hunting remained longer than the practice itself. Legal precedents, theological arguments, and procedural innovations continued to influence European jurisprudence for centuries. The psychological and social damage to affected communities lasted even longer. But ultimately, your profession died because the world moved beyond the fear and ignorance that had made it possible. Progress, knowledge, and human decency slowly overwhelmed the paranoia and cruelty that had sustained witch hunting for centuries. The age of the witch hunter was ending, not with fire and drama, but with the quiet advance of human understanding. Now let's discuss what happened to witch hunters after the profession became obsolete. Because retiring from a career built on torture and murder presented unique challenges that normal retirement planning couldn't address. Most witch hunters never got the chance to retire gracefully. The violent nature of the profession meant that many died young, either from the hazards of the work itself or from revenge by the families and communities they had terrorized. Your life expectancy was significantly shorter than the general population, and peaceful death in old age was a luxury few witch hunters enjoyed. Those who did survive to see the decline of their profession faced several unpleasant options. You could try to continue working in increasingly remote and backward regions where belief in witchcraft persisted, but these areas offered lower pay and greater risks as you became more isolated from legal protection and social support. Some former witch hunters attempted to transition into related fields. Law enforcement was a natural career shift, since many of the skills involved in witch hunting, intimidation, investigation, and violence were transferable to ordinary criminal work. But your reputation often preceded you, making employment difficult, even in contexts where your methods might be acceptable. Religious careers offered another possible transition. Some ex-witch hunters became priests, monks, or theological scholars, perhaps motivated by genuine repentance or simply seeking the protection that clerical status provided. But religious institutions were increasingly uncomfortable with associates who had participated in the more extreme forms of persecution. Academic pursuits attracted some former hunters who had developed expertise in theology, law, or natural philosophy during their careers. Writing treatises on demonology, legal procedure, or supernatural phenomena allowed you to monetize your knowledge, while distancing yourself from the practical application of that knowledge. Criminal enterprises provided opportunities for those whose consciences hadn't been entirely destroyed by their previous work. The skills learned in witch hunting could be applied to extortion, intimidation, political violence, or other forms of organized crime. Some former hunters became enforcers for nobles, merchants, or criminal organizations. Geographic relocation was often necessary to escape the reputation and enemies accumulated during your hunting career. Moving to distant regions where your history was unknown allowed for fresh starts, but also meant abandoning any positive relationships or support networks you might have developed. Identity changes were sometimes attempted, though difficult to maintain in societies where personal identity was closely tied to family, community, and professional reputation. False names, fabricated histories, and assumed identities required constant vigilance to maintain and could collapse if former associates or victims recognized you. Some ex-hunters attempted to make amends for their previous actions through charitable work, religious devotion, or public advocacy against persecution. But these efforts at redemption were often viewed with suspicion by communities that remembered their past actions and questioned their sincerity. Mental health problems were common among former witch hunters, though not understood or treated as such at the time. The psychological toll of years spent torturing and murdering innocent people manifested in various forms of breakdown, addiction, paranoia, and self-destructive behavior. Financial problems often accompanied retirement from witch hunting. The irregular income and high expenses of the profession meant that few hunters accumulated substantial savings. Property seized during witch hunts was sometimes subject to legal challenges or restitution claims that could wipe out whatever wealth had been accumulated. Legal vulnerability increased as attitudes toward witch hunting changed. Former hunters could face prosecution for murder, torture, or theft as new authorities reviewed past cases and applied different legal standards. The protection that official commissions had provided evaporated when political winds shifted. Social isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of life after witch hunting. The work created a unique form of social contamination that made normal relationships difficult or impossible. Even people who hadn't been directly affected by your actions might avoid association with someone known to have participated in mass persecution. Family relationships were often strained or destroyed by witch hunting careers. Spouses might leave, children might disown their parents, and extended family members might cut all contact. The shame and danger associated with the profession affected everyone connected to the hunter. Some former hunters became advocates for legal reform or opponents of persecution, perhaps motivated by genuine remorse or simply seeking to rehabilitate their reputations. These conversion narratives were sometimes accepted by reform-minded intellectuals, but remained suspect to most ordinary people. Suicide was not uncommon among retired witch hunters, either from guilt, despair, or fear of retribution. The psychological burden of their actions, combined with social isolation and economic hardship, made life unbearable for some former practitioners. A few hunters managed to achieve genuine redemption through religious conversion, charitable works, or public acknowledgement of their crimes. But these cases were rare and required extraordinary circumstances, including community forgiveness that was seldom forthcoming. The most successful post-career transitions were made by hunters who had maintained some separation between their public role and their private identity, who had developed alternative skills during their hunting careers, and who could relocate to regions where their history was unknown. But for most witch hunters, the end of their profession meant the end of any hope for normal human relationships, peaceful retirement, or social respectability. They had sold their souls for money and status, and when the market for soul selling collapsed, they were left with nothing but the memories of their victims and the weight of their crimes. The witch hunters, who had terrorized Europe for centuries, ended their days as pariahs, broken by the very profession that had once given them power and purpose. It was, perhaps, the only justice their victims ever received. Let's conclude by examining the true legacy of witch hunting and your role in one of history's most shameful chapters. Because the impact of your profession extended far beyond the individual lives you destroyed to shape European society, law, and culture for centuries to come. The numbers alone tell a horrifying story. Historians estimate that between 40 and 60 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe between 1,450 and 1,750, with hundreds of thousands more tortured, imprisoned, or forced to confess to crimes that existed only in the imagination of their persecutors. As a witch hunter, you were a direct participant in what amounted to a continent-wide genocide against vulnerable populations. But the statistical impact was only part of the damage. Witch hunting fundamentally changed how European societies understood justice, evidence, and the relationship between authority and individual rights. The legal innovations developed for prosecuting supernatural crimes, torture-extracted confessions, spectral evidence, presumption of guilt, influenced criminal law for generations. The targeting patterns revealed the deeper social dynamics that witch hunting served to reinforce. Approximately 80% of witch hunting victims were women, and they were disproportionately elderly, poor, widowed, or otherwise marginalized. Your profession didn't just eliminate individuals, it served as a tool for enforcing social hierarchies and eliminating inconvenient people. The psychological trauma inflicted on European communities by witch hunting was immeasurable. Entire generations grew up in societies where neighbors could be tortured to death based on rumors and accusations. The social trust that makes community life possible was systematically destroyed in regions that experienced intensive persecution. Economic development was severely impacted in areas that experienced major witch hunts. The loss of productive community members, the destruction of social capital, and the diversion of resources to persecution rather than development left many regions impoverished for decades or centuries. Medical and scientific progress was retarded by the persecution of healers, midwives, and others who possessed traditional knowledge about natural phenomena. The climate of fear created by witch hunting discouraged experimentation, observation, and the sharing of knowledge that drives intellectual advancement. Religious development was distorted by the emphasis on finding and destroying enemies rather than building positive spiritual communities. The association of Christianity with persecution and violence alienated many people from religious institutions and contributed to the secularization of European culture. Legal institutions were corrupted by the precedents and procedures developed for witch hunting. The normalization of torture, the acceptance of unreliable evidence, and the presumption of guilt in certain types of cases influenced criminal justice systems long after witchcraft prosecutions ended. The intellectual heritage of witch hunting included sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation, mass persuasion, and social control that would be rediscovered and refined by totalitarian movements in later centuries. The techniques you developed for manufacturing consent for mass murder were not forgotten. Cultural trauma from witch hunting persisted in folklore, literature, and popular consciousness for centuries. The fear of persecution, the suspicion of authority, and the memory of community breakdown influenced European mentality long after the last witch hunter retired. International relations were affected by the reputation for barbarism that witch hunting created. European powers that continued aggressive persecution into the 18th century found themselves diplomatically isolated and commercially disadvantaged compared to regions that had abandoned the practice. Gender relations were permanently altered by the gendered nature of witch hunting. The systematic persecution of women for supposed supernatural crimes reinforced ideas about female weakness, irrationality, and danger that influenced European attitudes toward women for centuries. But perhaps the most important legacy was the gradual recognition that witch hunting represented a fundamental failure of civilization. The eventual abandonment of your profession wasn't just a change in religious or legal fashion. It was an acknowledgement that society had been complicit in mass murder based on superstition and fear. The intellectual and legal reforms that ended witch-hunting concepts like burden of proof, rules of evidence, and individual rights became foundational principles of modern democratic societies. In a sense, witch hunting's greatest contribution to human progress was its own elimination and the safeguards developed to prevent its return. Modern scholars studying witch hunting have identified patterns of persecution that reappear in different forms throughout history. The scapegoating mechanisms, the use of confessions extracted under pressure, the targeting of vulnerable populations. These dynamics can be seen in political purges, ethnic cleansing, and other forms of systematic violence. The witch-hunting phenomenon also demonstrated the dangers of unchecked authority, mass hysteria, and the weaponization of fear for political purposes. These lessons remain relevant in contemporary societies that continue to struggle with persecution, discrimination, and the abuse of power. For the communities that survived witch hunting, recovery was slow and incomplete. Trust had to be rebuilt, institutions had to be reformed, and memories had to be processed. Some areas never fully recovered from the trauma of mass persecution. Individual witch hunters like yourself left behind no monuments, no grateful communities, no positive legacy of any kind. You were remembered, when you were remembered at all, as cautionary figures representing the dangers of fanaticism, greed, and the corruption of authority. The victims of witch hunting, by contrast, have increasingly been recognized as martyrs to superstition and injustice. Memorials, scholarly research, and popular culture have worked to restore their humanity and acknowledge the crimes committed against them. The ultimate irony of the witch-hunting profession was that it created the very evil it claimed to fight against. By unleashing mass violence, destroying communities, and corrupting legal and religious institutions, witch hunters became the monsters they supposedly existed to eliminate. Your profession ended not because the threat of witchcraft was eliminated, but because people finally recognized that the threat had never existed in the first place. The real evil was in the response, not the supposed crime. And so the witch hunters of medieval and early modern Europe remain in history as a warning about what happens when fear overcomes reason, when authority serves itself rather than justice, and when ordinary people allow themselves to become complicit in the systematic destruction of the innocent. The world moved beyond you, and in doing so, became a more just and humane place. Your profession's extinction was one of civilization's greatest achievements, and your memory serves now only as a reminder of how far humanity has progressed and how vigilant it must remain to prevent the return of such darkness. The witch hunters are gone, but the lessons of their evil remain, and perhaps that is the only good they ever accomplished. But let's dive deeper into the truly horrifying day-to-day reality of being a witch hunter, because the psychological degradation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical process of becoming less human with each case, each interrogation, each execution. Your first kill was always the hardest. Maybe it was an elderly woman who reminded you of your grandmother, or a young mother who begged you to spare her children. The initial shock of watching someone burn alive because of your accusations would hit you like a physical blow. The smell, the sounds, the knowledge that you had caused this to happen. Most new witch hunters dealt with this trauma by drinking heavily, developing elaborate justifications, or simply shutting down emotionally. You'd tell yourself she was guilty, that you were doing God's work, that the community was safer now. But deep down, in the quiet moments before sleep, you knew what you had become. The second killing was easier. Your psychological defenses were already in place, your justifications more refined. By the third or fourth execution, you might find yourself taking notes on technique, observing which methods produced faster confessions or more dramatic public spectacles. By your 10th victim, you had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. You weren't just killing people, you were studying them. How long could someone withstand specific tortures? Which threats were most effective against different personality types? How could you maximize the psychological impact of an execution on the watching crowd? You developed a professional detachment that was more chilling than outright sadism. The people you tortured and killed weren't enemies or victims. They were case studies, problems to be solved, obstacles to professional advancement. Their humanity had been erased not by hatred, but by indifference. The transformation wasn't just psychological, it was physical. Years of torture work gave you strong hands and arms, but also a distinctive smell that came from constant exposure to fear, pain, and death. Your face would develop a particular expression, a cold evaluation that made people uncomfortable even when you weren't working. Children would cross streets to avoid you. Animals would shy away from your touch. Even priests would hurry through conversations, eager to escape your presence. You carried an aura of corruption that was visible to everyone, even if they couldn't quite articulate what they were sensing. Your sleep patterns would change as the work progressed. Nightmares became so common that you'd develop strategies for managing them, often involving alcohol or religious rituals that provided temporary relief. But the dreams always returned, filled with the faces of your victims and the sounds of their final moments. Eating became difficult, as food would trigger memories of torture sessions. The smell of roasting meat might remind you of burning flesh. The sound of someone crying might echo screams from the torture chamber. Simple human experiences became contaminated by your professional activities. Relationships became impossible to maintain. How could you explain your work to a potential spouse? How could you hold a child knowing what your hands had done? How could you pray in church, surrounded by people whose relatives you might have killed? The isolation wasn't just social, it was existential. You existed in a space between the normal human world and something far darker. You couldn't fully return to ordinary life, but you also couldn't find peace in your chosen profession. You were trapped in a liminal space of your own creation. Some witch hunters tried to find redemption through increasingly extreme religious practices. They might spend hours in prayer, donate large sums to churches, or undertake pilgrimages seeking forgiveness. But these efforts usually failed because they couldn't undo the fundamental change in their nature that the work had caused. Others attempted to justify their actions through scholarly pursuits, writing elaborate treatises on demonology or legal procedure. These intellectual exercises served as sophisticated forms of denial, allowing them to think of themselves as scholars rather than murderers. The most psychologically damaged hunters began to see witchcraft everywhere, not just in their professional cases, but in every aspect of daily life. A bird flying in an unusual pattern became evidence of supernatural activity. A stranger's glance was interpreted as a magical attack. The paranoia that had been useful for professional purposes consumed their entire existence. And then there were those who eventually broke completely. They might confess publicly to their crimes, seek sanctuary in monasteries, or simply disappear into the wilderness. Some committed suicide rather than continue living with the weight of their actions. But perhaps the most disturbing outcome was the hunters who never broke at all. These individuals seemed to adapt completely to their profession, showing no signs of psychological damage or moral conflict. They became perfect instruments of persecution, efficient and emotionless machines for converting suspicion into death. These functional psychopaths were often the most successful witch hunters, rising to positions of authority and training new generations in their methods. They represented the ultimate corruption possible in the profession, the complete elimination of human empathy and moral reasoning. The tragedy was that most people who became witch hunters weren't inherently evil. They were ordinary individuals who had been placed in extraordinary circumstances and had gradually adapted to meet the demands of their environment. The profession didn't attract monsters, it created them. Now, let's examine the specific techniques you used to break down innocent people during interrogations. Because your success depended not just on physical torture, but on sophisticated psychological manipulation that would destroy a person's sense of reality and self-worth. The process always began before the suspect even reached the torture chamber. You'd have them held in isolation, often in underground cells with no natural light, no human contact except for guards who were forbidden to speak, and minimal food and water. This sensory deprivation would begin the process of psychological breakdown within hours. Sleep deprivation was your next tool. Guards would poke the suspect with sticks every time they tried to rest, or you'd have them kept standing for days at a time. The human mind becomes extremely malleable when deprived of sleep, with hallucinations and confusion setting in remarkably quickly. You'd also manipulate their sense of time by keeping them in windowless rooms where day and night lost all meaning. Meals would be provided at irregular intervals, making it impossible for them to maintain any sense of routine or control. This temporal disorientation added to their psychological vulnerability. The first interrogation session would establish your complete control over their environment. You'd have them brought to a room where they could see torture devices, but wouldn't immediately use them. Instead, you'd ask simple questions about their daily routines, their relationships, their beliefs. Every answer would be treated as suspicious. If they spoke confidently, you'd accuse them of rehearsing lies. If they hesitated, you'd claim they were hiding something. If they broke down and cried, you'd say they were showing guilt. There was literally no response that couldn't be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. You'd gradually introduce inconsistencies into your questioning, asking the same questions in different ways, and then claiming their answers were contradictory. This would make them doubt their own memory and perception, a crucial step in breaking down their psychological defenses. The presence of scribes, carefully recording everything they said, would add to the pressure. You'd make a show of having their words written down, emphasizing that everything was being permanently recorded and could be used against them. The act of documentation made their situation feel more serious and hopeless. You'd also use their relationships against them. Mentioning their children, spouses, or parents in threatening ways would increase their emotional distress. You might claim that their family members were also under suspicion, or that their cooperation could protect their loved ones from similar treatment. False evidence was a powerful tool for psychological manipulation. You'd present them with confessions from other supposed witches, naming them as accomplices, or with witness testimony describing their supernatural activities. These fabricated documents would make them feel that resistance was pointless. The good cop, bad cop routine was remarkably effective even in medieval contexts. You might alternate between threatening violence and offering sympathy, creating a psychological dependence where they began to see you as their protector rather than their persecutor. Religious manipulation was particularly devastating for devout Christians. You'd quote scripture out of context to support your accusations, suggest that God had abandoned them, or claim that confession was their only path to salvation. Their faith, which should have been a source of strength, became another weapon against them. You'd also exploit their ignorance about legal procedures. Most suspects had no understanding of their rights or the judicial process, so you could make false claims about what would happen to them or what their options were. This legal intimidation was often more effective than physical threats. The concept of leading questions was perfected in witch hunting contexts. Instead of asking, "Did you attend a witch's Sabbath?" you'd ask, "How many times did you attend Sabbaths?" Or, "Who else was present when you met with the devil?" These questions assumed guilt and made denial more difficult. Time pressure was another psychological weapon. You'd claim that cooperation now would lead to mercy, while continued resistance would result in harsher treatment. This artificial urgency would push them toward confession before they had time to think clearly about their situation. Shame and humiliation were powerful tools for breaking down psychological resistance. Stripping suspects naked, forcing them to endure intimate examinations, or making them perform degrading acts would destroy their sense of dignity and self-worth. The gradual escalation of threats and minor tortures would create anticipatory anxiety that was often worse than the actual pain. Knowing that things would get progressively worse made each moment of current suffering feel like a brief respite rather than an injustice. You'd also manipulate their perception of reality by introducing supernatural elements into the interrogation. Strange noises, flickering lights, or mysterious drafts could be interpreted as demonic manifestations, making them feel that they were indeed surrounded by supernatural forces. The most insidious technique was convincing them that they might actually be guilty without knowing it. You'd suggest that the devil could work through people without their conscious knowledge, or that they might have suppressed memories of supernatural activities. This planted seeds of self-doubt that would grow under continued pressure. By the time you introduced physical torture, their psychological defenses had already been systematically destroyed. The actual pain was almost secondary to the complete breakdown of their sense of reality, identity, and hope. They would confess not because the torture was unbearable, but because they had been convinced that confession was their only escape from a nightmare that would never end. These psychological techniques were perhaps more damaging than the physical torture because they left invisible scars that could never heal. Even if someone survived a witch hunt, they would carry the psychological damage for the rest of their lives, never fully recovering their sense of self or trust in reality. Finally, let's examine the broader cultural impact of witch hunting on European society, because your profession didn't just kill individuals. It poisoned the collective consciousness of entire civilizations in ways that persisted for centuries. The normalization of torture as a judicial procedure extended far beyond witchcraft cases. Legal systems across Europe adopted interrogation techniques developed for witch hunting and applied them to ordinary criminal cases. The precedent that extreme pain could be used to extract truth became embedded in European jurisprudence. Childhood development was severely impacted in communities that experienced witch hunts. Children who witnessed public executions, heard stories of supernatural persecution, or lived in atmospheres of constant suspicion developed psychological problems that affected them throughout their lives. Entire generations grew up with trauma that was never acknowledged or treated. Educational development was retarded by the climate of fear surrounding intellectual curiosity. Teachers were afraid to discuss natural phenomena that might be interpreted as supernatural. Students were discouraged from asking questions that might suggest dangerous knowledge. The pursuit of learning became associated with the risk of persecution. Artistic expression was constrained by the need to avoid any content that might be interpreted as supernatural or heretical. Writers, painters, and musicians had to carefully consider whether their work might attract unwanted attention from authorities looking for evidence of witchcraft or demonic influence. Scientific progress was significantly slowed by the persecution of individuals who possessed knowledge about natural phenomena. Herbalists, astronomers, alchemists, and early medical practitioners were frequent targets of witch hunting, creating a brain drain that impacted technological and intellectual development. Women's participation in economic and social life was severely restricted by the gendered nature of witch hunting. The constant threat of accusation made women afraid to be too visible, too successful, or too independent. This reinforced patriarchal structures and limited women's contributions to society. Religious development was distorted by the emphasis on identifying and destroying enemies rather than building positive spiritual communities. Christianity became associated with persecution and violence rather than love and forgiveness, contributing to long-term secularization trends. Medical practice was devastated by the targeting of traditional healers and midwives. Communities lost access to healthcare providers and accumulated medical knowledge, leading to increased mortality and reduced quality of life. The association between healing and witchcraft discouraged medical innovation. Social trust, the foundation of community life, was systematically destroyed in areas that experienced intensive witch hunting. Neighbors learned to fear and suspect each other, family members became potential accusers, and social institutions lost their legitimacy. Some communities never recovered this essential social capital. Economic development suffered from the loss of productive community members, the diversion of resources to persecution, and the general atmosphere of instability and fear. Regions that experienced major witch hunts often remained economically depressed for generations. Legal institutions were corrupted by the precedents and procedures developed for witch hunting. The acceptance of unreliable evidence, the use of torture to extract confessions, and the presumption of guilt in certain cases influenced criminal justice systems long after witchcraft prosecutions ended. International relations were affected by the reputation for barbarism that witch hunting created. European regions that continued aggressive persecution found themselves diplomatically isolated and commercially disadvantaged compared to areas that had abandoned the practice. Literary and cultural production was influenced by themes of persecution, supernatural threat, and social breakdown that emerged from the witch hunting experience. These themes appeared in folklore, popular literature, and artistic works for centuries, shaping European cultural consciousness. The concept of scapegoating became deeply embedded in European political culture through the witch hunting experience. The techniques used to identify, blame, and eliminate supposed supernatural threats were later applied to ethnic minorities, political dissidents, and other vulnerable groups. Gender relations were permanently altered by the systematic persecution of women for supposed supernatural crimes. Ideas about female weakness, irrationality, and inherent danger that were reinforced by witch hunting influenced European attitudes toward women for centuries. The intellectual heritage of witch hunting included sophisticated methods of mass persuasion, social control, and psychological manipulation that influenced later political movements. Totalitarian regimes of the 20th century drew upon techniques pioneered by witch hunters for managing public opinion and eliminating opposition. Educational curricula were affected by the need to avoid topics that might be associated with supernatural knowledge or heretical thinking. This intellectual timidity persisted long after witch hunting ended, limiting educational innovation and intellectual development. Professional development in fields like medicine, law, and religion was constrained by the association between expertise and potential supernatural corruption. Practitioners had to carefully balance competence with orthodoxy, limiting their ability to innovate or challenge existing practices. Urban development was affected by the need to accommodate public executions, provide security for persecution activities, and manage the social disruption caused by witch hunting. City planning and architecture reflected the priorities of a society organized around identifying and eliminating internal enemies. Military development was influenced by the techniques and personnel involved in witch hunting. Some professional soldiers supplemented their income by working as witch hunters, while military tactics were adapted for use in civilian persecution activities. The ultimate cultural legacy of witch hunting was a deep skepticism about authority, expertise, and social institutions that persisted long after the practice ended. Europeans learned to be suspicious of claims about supernatural threats, but they also became generally distrustful of anyone claiming special knowledge or authority. This cultural transformation was perhaps the most important long-term effect of witch hunting. It contributed to the development of Enlightenment values, scientific skepticism, and democratic institutions that required accountability and transparency from those in power. The witch-hunting era taught European civilization hard lessons about the dangers of unchecked authority, mass hysteria, and the weaponization of fear for political purposes. These lessons became part of the intellectual foundation for modern democratic societies and human rights protections. But the price of this education was enormous. Tens of thousands of innocent lives lost, communities destroyed, and centuries of cultural and intellectual development retarded by fear and superstition. The witch hunters like yourself were the unwitting architects of one of history's most expensive educational experiences. And so we return to where we began. You, the medieval witch hunter, trapped in a profession that promised righteousness but delivered only corruption, that offered justice but provided only cruelty, that claimed to protect society but systematically destroyed everything that made society worth protecting. Your legacy is written in blood, preserved in the screams of your victims, and remembered as a warning about what humans become when they abandon their humanity in service of fear and hatred. The witch hunters are gone, but the evil they represent remains an eternal threat to civilization, requiring constant vigilance to prevent its return. In the end, that vigilance may be the only redemption possible for the sins of your profession, ensuring that future generations never again allow fear to overcome reason, never again permit authority to serve itself rather than justice, and never again become complicit in the systematic destruction of the innocent. The witch hunters taught us what monsters we can become. Our responsibility is to ensure we never forget that lesson.